Somewhere in the street was an old house. It was almost 300 years old, for there was the date, cut into the beam with tulips and leaves all around it, as clear as day. There were old verses, too, and over each window was carved a grinning face. The rest of the houses in the street were new and shining. They obviously would have nothing to do with the old house, and it was evident that they were thinking, "How much longer is this tumble-down old thing going to be in our street? It's a disgrace." Across the street stood some more shining new houses, and they felt exactly the same way. But at the window of one of them sat a little boy with fresh pink cheeks and bright blue eyes. It was perfectly clear that he liked the old house best, for when he looked across at the wall where the plaster had fallen off, he imagined that he saw all kinds of curious pictures. It was truly a fascinating house. An old gentleman lived there. He always wore velvet knee breeches, a coat with big brass buttons, and a wig that was obviously a real wig. Every morning an old servant came to straighten up his rooms and run errands for him. But other than that, the old gentleman was all alone in the old house. One day the little boy heard his father say to his mother, "The old gentleman across the way is very well off, but he's so terribly lonely." The very next Sunday the little boy wrapped something up and went downstairs. When the servant who ran the errands passed by, he said to him, "Oh, please, sir, would you take this to the old gentleman? It's one of my tin soldiers. I've got two, and I want him to have one because I know he's so terribly lonely." The old servant looked immensely pleased, nodded his head, and took the tin soldier over to the old house. A little while later he came back to ask if the little boy would like to come himself and visit the old gentleman. His parents said he might, so he went over to the old house. The brass knobs on the railing shone much brighter than usual. You would think they had been polished specially in honor of his visit. And it seemed as if the carved trumpeters, yes, there really were trumpeters carved on the door. Well, it seemed as if the trumpeters were blowing with all their might, puffing their cheeks out like balloons. And then the door opened. The entrance hall was full of old portraits. There were knights in armor and ladies in silken gowns. At last the little boy came to the room where the old gentleman sat by the window. "Thank you for the tin soldier, little friend," said the old gentleman. "I'm so glad you've come for a visit." "They say at home that you're so terribly lonely," said the little boy. "Oh, I have quite a few visitors," answered the old gentleman. "They're old memories mostly. Now you have come. I really can't complain." Then the old gentleman went into the other room to get some apples and nuts and jam. It was just like a party. But suddenly the tin soldier, who had been put on a chest, said, "I can't stand it. It's so lonely and dull here. The old gentleman is really too lonely for words. He never gets a kiss, he never gets a friendly look, or even a Christmas tree. I tell you, I can't stand it." "I don't see why you should be unhappy," said the little boy. "I think it's fun to be here. Think of all the old memories that come visiting. I really don't understand you." "But I don't see the memories, and if I did I wouldn't know them anyway," said the tin soldier. "I can't stand it." "But you have to," said the little boy. The old gentleman now came back looking very cheerful and brought in the most delicious jam and apples and nuts that the little boy promptly forgot all about the tin soldier. It was a happy little boy that went home again. Days and weeks passed, till one day the little boy went over for another visit. It was just exactly like the first time, for in the old house days came and went, but everything stayed the same. "I can't stand it," said the tin soldier, crying tin tears. "It's so depressing here. Now I know what it means to have visits from one's old memories. A few of my own came visiting, and believe me, that's no fun. I can't stand it." "I gave you away," said the little boy. "Don't you see? You've simply got to stay here." And then the old gentleman brought out a box filled with all sorts of things. Little boxes of coins, amber bottles filled with perfume, old cards, much bigger and more elaborate than you see nowadays. And how his eyes sparkled. "I want to go and fight! I want to go and fight!" shouted the tin soldier as loud as he could. And then he threw himself down on the floor. But what had become of him? The old gentleman and the little boy hunted and hunted, but he had fallen through one of the holes in the floor, and he had completely disappeared. So the little boy went home again. 1 week passed, then several more. The snow was all over the ground. It had drifted into all the scrolls and crevices in the old house. It even smothered the front doorsteps, just as if no one lived in the old house at all. And in truth, no one did live there any more, for the old gentleman had died. That evening a carriage pulled up to the door of the old house, and some people carried him down to it. They were taking him into the country to a cemetery. That's where he went. But nobody was there to look after him. Only the little boy was the least bit interested, and he blew a kiss to the old gentleman as he drove off. A few days later the old house was put up for sale. The little boy watched everything being taken away. Some of the things went here, while others went there. And in the spring, the house itself was torn down, for all the rest of the people on the street said that it was an eyesore. And then the site was cleared. "Well, thank goodness we're rid of that," said the neighboring houses. A beautiful new house was built in its place. It had large windows and smooth white walls, but on the spot where the old house had actually stood, there was a little garden. Now the little boy had quite grown up. He had grown up to be a fine man, and he had just been married, and he and his wife moved into the new house with the garden. One day when he was standing by her side watching her plant one of the flowers that she loved, all of a sudden she cried a little cry. She had cut her finger on something sharp that was poking up out of the ground. What was it? It was, believe it or not, the tin soldier. The very same one that had toppled off the chest in the old gentleman's room years and years and years ago, and after much jumbling and jostling, had stayed hidden in the ground for all this time. "Why, let me look at him," said the young man, and then he laughed and shook his head. "Oh, I know he couldn't possibly be the same one, but You know, he reminds me of something that happened to me connected with a tin soldier when I was a very little boy." And then he told his young wife about the old house and the old gentleman and the tin soldier he'd sent to him because he was so terribly lonely. And the young wife's eyes filled with tears, and she said softly, "How terribly lonely he must have been." "Terribly lonely," said the tin soldier, "but it's wonderful not to be forgotten."